Well, hello, I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to Macduff Lives, and welcome to another reading from our book, I guess our book of the spring of 2023. It's called A Law Unto Itself, The Untold Story of the Law Firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, 100 Years of Creating Power and Wealth, by Nancy Lisagor and Frank Lipsius. And I'm very grateful to them for having written this book. It gives us a real behind the scenes look into the development of what became the most powerful law firm in the 20th century. And the kind of darker side is shown. Certainly not all of it, but the curtain is definitely pulled back in a number of instances. Um, as we will find as we keep reading, good morning to all of you, Christy, Laura, David, and thanks for joining me. And I think I'll have a sip of coffee. And Jimmy, how are you, man? Okay, a law unto itself. And last time we were concentrating on Alan Welsh Dulles, the younger of the two brothers, but now this chapter, chapter 7, is the rise and rise of John Foster Dulles. The real culprits are some of the leading law firms who make such a fat killing out of the abuses which brought the Securities Act into existence. They really want to do business at the old stand. They have come out of their storm cellars of fear, not to improve, but to chloroform the act. A quote from Felix Frankfurter. Sullivan and Cromwell managing partner Royal Victor was within sight of the Oyster Bay Yacht Club on the second day of the season's first regatta. It was a beautiful sunny day with a light breeze in May 1926 when he gasped and fell to the deck of his yacht, the Snoekabus. Another racer, noticing the boat buffeted in the wind, came alongside. With Victor lying on deck, a launch towed the boat to shore. Victor's inert body was carried into the clubhouse, where a doctor pronounced him dead. The third day of the regatta was canceled, and in a front page obituary in the New York Times, the 48-year-old lawyer was called, quote, one of the ablest lawyers engaged in corporate practice in the city, unquote. Has an interesting resonance to today, does it not? His death caused a succession crisis at Sullivan and Cromwell because it quickly followed the loss of three other major partners. Columbia Law School Dean Harlan Fiske Stone, who had sent his best students to the firm, rejoined the firm in September 1923 to head the litigation group. At a time when the firm was making $1.2 million, Stone was promised $100,000 a year, but he quit within a year to accept the appointment of U.S. Attorney General from his Amherst classmate Calvin Coolidge in the new Republican administration. Though Stone had expected to return to the firm, he was appointed to the Supreme Court 15 months later. Dulles wrote his congratulations, quote, with a heavy heart, unquote, admitting that, quote, it is a matter of great personal disappointment that this seems to postpone indefinitely the prospect of your return here with us, unquote. In March 1925, Alfred Yaretsky Sr. died at the age of 63 after a 2-month battle with stomach cancer. Henry Hill Pierce, who was a leader in utilities work and training associates, contracted an unspecified illness called sleeping sickness at the time, which grew worse as the decade drew on. He shuffled slowly, spoke with an increasing stutter, and finally resigned in 1928. To tide the firm over, Cromwell decided to appoint a four-man directorate composed of John Foster Dulles, Wilbur L. Cummings, and the two cousins Edward Green and Eustace Seligman. Dulles had worked his way into the heart of the firm and now fully involved himself in its domestic work by taking over from Cromwell such important clients as International Nickel, American Banknote, Cuban Cane Sugar, and the Gold Dust Corporation. He continued to conduct his European work through a number of associates who became important partners. They included Arthur H. Dean, Norris Darrell, and George Sharp. Handling recruitment and pay in the new regime, Dulles immediately offered a job to his brother, Allen. Allen, who worried about, quote, keeping my head above water financially, unquote, had attended Foster's alma mater, George Washington University Law School, while continuing at the State Department. He found Foster's overture, quote, more flattering than a neophyte in the law firm had a right to expect, unquote, but hesitated. To placate him, Foster discussed his brother's belated legal career at the age of 33 with John W. Davis of Davis, Polk, Wardrell, Gardner, and Reed, but gradually won him over to Sullivan and Cromwell. Allen Dulles started at the firm in October 1926, 5 months after Foster Dulles had taken over recruiting. It's an interesting comment. Also very interesting, the connection with Harlan Fiske Stone, which I had not been aware of until David Cranmer Underdown made me aware. It's it's a big club and we're not in it, says George Carlin. But all of these deaths that happen around the same time, is there a hidden hand here? Especially, just a sudden death on a boat and, well, what was the other one that I thought was, oh, the stomach cancer. Yeah. Because that's, I think, what happened to Chamberlain in Britain when he was not fighting the war, the phoning war time. Um, they do know how to put things like polonium inside of people. And, whether that happened now here or even just radium, even before that, it's it's not beyond possibility, but of course it's just speculation. Not everyone, not even a future Supreme Court justice, could expect the same treatment. William O. Douglas remembered being interviewed for a job at Sullivan and Cromwell in 1926, at which time he found Foster, quote, pontifical. He made it appear that the greatest favor he could do a young lawyer was to hire him. He seemed to me like a high church man out to exploit someone. In fact, I was so struck by Dulles's pomposity that when he helped me on with my coat, as I was leaving his office, I turned and gave him a quarter tip. Well, I don't think William O. Douglas is going to be working at Sullivan and Cromwell. In 1927, Dulles became sole managing partner and, despite continuing deference to Cromwell, remolded the firm in his own image and habits. His style reflected the aloofness of his personal relations and lax disregard of details. This made Dulles easy to work for, according to lawyers close to him like George Sharp, the son of the American ambassador to France when Dulles was at the Versailles Treaty negotiations. Sharp said that Dulles, quote, never would say, you must do this or you mustn't do that, but he would put up certain guideposts that he knew would be of help to me, and I always felt that I had his entire confidence in going ahead and using my own judgment on the spot. Not surprisingly, Sharp considered this a great pleasure and a welcome relief from the attitude of several other of my partners who always felt that they had to, dot the I's and cross the T's by cablegram. Dulles leaned back in the chair in his spacious corner office as lawyers paraded in to keep him abreast of clients' affairs. He bought his suits at the annual Brooks Brothers sale after Christmas, preferring those of a sickly green color that were always in stock during the clearance sales. From his bout with malaria in the Central American jungle, he retained a tick in his eye 2 decades later, and he constantly patted down his hair. He sucked on a pipe as he listened, incessantly tamping it, making his lawyers nervous as he seemed to drift off into his own thoughts. The pipe routine was altered after dinner when he smoked a cheap White Owl cigar for its laxative effect. To go with his new position, he cultivated a dignified, reserved, old man air. If he was asked for an opinion, he stood up, paced the floor silently for about 5 minutes, and recited all facts given to him until he had formulated his thoughts and had droned his opinion in a slow monotone. He showed that he had been listening by getting to the central points, but he did not drill subordinates the way Cromwell did. Dulles was relaxed, trusting, not a worrier. Quote, once he had considered a matter, he made up his mind. I don't think he ever gave it another thought, George Sharp believed. He certainly didn't carry it home and toss about it in bed at night. I think that he felt that he'd done everything he could do, and that was that. Despite his forbidding air and professional reserve, Dulles attracted great loyalty from those close to him. He had a small coterie of colleagues who saw an entirely different side of the man. To them, he was playful and engaging. The wife of banker George Murnane chided him every time he visited them. Quote, for God's sake, Foster, get yourself a larger hat. You look like Humpty Dumpty, unquote. And Dulles laughed uproariously. He was considered more able to appreciate than initiate a joke, but he wrote an elaborate spoof letter to Polly Dean, the wife of Dulles's younger partner, Art Dean. Having convinced Polly to make a book, Be the Banker, to make book, that is, Be the Banker, at Henry L. Stimson's annual Columbus Day races at his Huntington, Long Island farm, Dulles sent her a letter with the typewritten return address, quote, Office of Collector of Illegal Revenue, Bridge of Sighs, New York, unquote. The joke involved not only her untaxed racetrack earnings, but also the legalese used in their professional writing. Dear Madam, it began, purporting to be from a tax inspector. Information has come to me. Oh, blah, blah, blah. I will skip it and pass on because it's a little bit dry. Thinking it was from the Internal Revenue Service, Polly Dean was in tears, meeting her husband at the train station after getting the letter. When he laughed at Foster's obvious joke, starting with, quote, illegal for internal, she almost threw him out of the car. He convinced her that it was a joke, and when she confronted Foster, he turned it into a homily, warning her, quote, well, you were so brash. You wanted to make book. You were so determined, and you were having so much fun. Now, just let that be a lesson to you. Dean called Dulles, quote, a master theologian. The informal Dulles at home, drinking gin during Prohibition and stirring it with his finger, would have been unrecognizable to most firm lawyers who saw the managing partner as a stern moralist with no humor. He rarely mixed business and home life, but when he took his children sailing, they stopped in at ports where clients had offices for factory tours he had arranged for them. He also let his son Avery use the firm office on Saturday to type up schoolwork, which Dulles had printed by the firm's securities printer. To the public and to most Sullivan and Cromwell associates, the only humor associated with John Foster Dulles occurred in 1957 when Carol Burnett launched her career with the song, quote, I made a fool of myself over John Foster Dulles, unquote, which got which her subject got a copy of because he enjoyed it so much. Well, I guess that might be a hint into how Carol Burnett got started, but she's one of my favorite actors, comedians, you know, great show. But I never heard of that song before. As managing partner, Dulles cast his influence over all firm business, domestic and foreign. A high priority, it seemed, was to make sure he did not miss the final surge of the stock market boom. Though he had not participated before, he jumped at the chance when former associate Waddell Catchings, who had gone to Goldman Sachs, offered, quote, to include you in the selling group, which will give you the selling commission, unquote. It proved to be one of the most overblown financial concoctions of the whole crazy 1920s, the Goldman Sachs Trading Company. The frenzy hit Dulles when he replied to Catchings in two letters on the same day on November 1928. The first asking for 50,000 in shares and dollars in shares, and the second to, quote, raise my participation in the GS company to $75,000. Dulles even reserved shares for his mother, who wrote him gratefully, quote, I certainly thank you very much for getting me such a good investment and for letting me have the benefit of your price, unquote. As astute bankers, Goldman Sachs had avoided the manic Wall Street craze of the 1920s until the very end. Then, throwing caution to the winds, it not only put together an investment trust at the very last gasp of the boom, but also named it the Goldman Sachs Trading Company, which tied the reputation of the bank to the fortunes of its new business. The public was so eager to buy shares that Goldman Sachs decided to double its initial capitalization and raised $100 million instead of $50 million. It had a hard time deciding even where to invest so much money until John Foster Dulles put the bankers together with his utilities client, Harrison Williams, to make a speculative alliance of fiendish magnitude. All right, stop and catch my breath for a minute. It's starting to get thick. Okay, so now suddenly, on page 104, John Foster Dulles has decided to get into the investment business. And for some reason, he picks Goldman Sachs. And Goldman Sachs, for some reason, has stayed out of the manic Wall Street craze of the 20s until the very end. And then Goldman Sachs, for some reason, creates a trust at the very last gasp of the boom, which tied the reputation of Goldman Sachs Trading Company to the fortunes of its new business. The public was so eager to buy shares that Goldman Sachs decided to double its capitalization and raised 100 million instead of 50 million. Isn't that just almost like a miracle? I mean, a whole series of miracles. And this whole chapter starts with some kind of incredibly coincidental losses of the primary partners of the firm. Cromwell's still there, but steps back to John Foster Dulles at the same time that Dulles is now taking the reins by working with financiers. And Goldman Sachs seems to have some magic touch. Where does it come from? We'll talk to David Cranmer Underdown about this real soon. David's here. Hello, David. Hello, Mobster. Hi, guys. Being here, Miss Hunt, Corky, and Jimmy and Laura, thank you for being here. This is exciting American history that nobody knows, and I'm really thrilled to be reading it. Harrison Williams was the father of the New Jersey senator jailed in the abscam scandals of the 1980s and a schemer of the first order. With Goldman Sachs, he created two trusts, the Shenandoah Corporation and the Blue Ridge Corporation. Williams sold $5 million for Williams paid $5 million for 40% of Shenandoah, while the public paid $17 million for 20%. He then paid himself back out of the public subscription, making an overall profit, including his shares, of $40 million just on the initial public offering. The Goldman Sachs Trading Company shares jumped up in 8 months from an offering price of $100 a share to $280 a share. Shenandoah and Blue Ridge, with assets of $200 million, offered to buy 21 of America's leading companies, including American Telegram and Telegraph, U.S. Steel, General Electric, and Eastman Kodak. Williams was a paper billionaire. His wife, regularly voted America's best dressed woman, expected a Sullivan and Cromwell lawyer to take care of her 74 trunks when her private ship docked in New York. See, back then they didn't have yachts, they had ships. Despite his personal stake, Dulles' first reaction to the stock market crash on October 24th, 1929, was relief. He wrote a London banker, quote, "On the whole, I think it is a healthy development." But as a member of the board of directors of Shenandoah and Blue Ridge, Dulles faced numerous shareholders' lawsuits as his stocks plummeted in value from $280 to $1.25 a share. One of the suits, Austrian et al. Versus Williams, Sullivan and Cromwell won in the Supreme Court because the statute of limitations had run out. Another, Marco versus Dulles, Arthur Dean finally won after a determined fight he waged, quote, "because of the slurs on Foster's reputation and the money involved," unquote. The Court of Appeals decision came in 1968, 40 years from those heady days of carefree investing in 1929, and 10 years after Dulles had died. His wife never got any of his legacy because the case was not finally settled until after her death in 1969. But she lived comfortably since Dulles had taken the precaution of putting most of the family money in her name so that his estate was only $1 million, compared with her $7 million, which greatly surprised their children. The market crash was healthy for the firm, but not to clear the air for further investment in Europe, as Dulles had assumed. This was no mere correction, but a financial bloodbath. As usual, it gave Sullivan and Cromwell more work. There was, to start with, a huge volume of stock trading, certificates of which lawyers in those days transferred for stockbroking clients. Lawson Stone, one of more than 60 lawyers in the firm, handled $20 million of securities in one day as market volume exploded in the wake of the crash. Goldman Sachs and Company, which dearly regretted putting its own name on its investment trust, faced, quote, "suits on every conceivable basis," unquote, according to the bank's partner, Walter Sachs. Quote, "I mean, on the basis of the fact that people had lost money. That's the basis. They charged us with neglect and with fraud and with this and that, you see. That's a long history. To find the answers, you'd have to delve into the files of Sullivan and Cromwell," unquote. Goldman Sachs lost altogether $13 million and settled with the biggest plaintiffs, while Sullivan and Cromwell made money from the suits of Dulles's labor. At Sullivan and Cromwell, 1929 was best remembered for the increasing evidence of John Foster Dulles's lavishness. Dulles's ambition made him want Sullivan and Cromwell to have extensive international connections, prestige, and domestic importance to reflect well on its managing partner. He quickly expanded the firm around the world. He opened offices in Berlin and Buenos Aires. In Paris, the firm hired half a dozen lawyers and moved out of Cromwell's one room in the Ritz into a whole floor of an office building behind the hotel. In New York, the firm moved to opulent new quarters at 48 Wall Street. At a time when the existing standard of law office decor was roll-top desks and cracked leather sofas, Dulles preferred the elegance of wall-to-wall carpets and a winding staircase connecting the floors. One of the partners of Davis, Polk, Wardwell, Gardner, and Reed came over and commented implicitly, comparing the decor to a call house. Quote, "It's very nice. I might stay for a drink, but I don't think I'll go upstairs," unquote. From the time Dulles took over and for two succeeding decades, Sullivan and Cromwell was the largest law firm in the world. Quote, white shoe firms like Sullivan and Cromwell included Davis Polk, Sherman and Sterling, Millbank, Tweed, Hope and Webb, Cravath, de Gersdorff, Swain and Wood, White and Case, and Cotton, Franklin, Wright and Gordon. Dulles' taking over as senior partner raised the firm's social standing after all. He had had his first White House appointment at the age of 4 to attend a birthday party of President Benjamin Harrison's grandson, while Dulles' grandfather was Secretary of State. But other firms had great social distinction. Every partner of Davis Polk, for instance, was in the social register. According to novelist Louis Auchincloss, whose father was a Davis Polk partner, asterisk, there's another Auchincloss for you guys. Quote, the firm would have been shocked that its senior partner would ever be Jewish, unquote, as occurred in the 1980s, where Davis Polk epitomized aristocratic law, which included most of the white shoe firms. Sullivan and Cromwell, with its hardworking Jewish partners, epitomized and anticipated the meritocracy that would ultimately overtake all Wall Street practices. As the largest firm, Sullivan and Cromwell seemed more than the others to have the archetypal big business practice. Interesting point about the Jewish lawyers. And if I just stop and make a comment of bringing in once again the many interesting discussions I've had with David Cranmer Underdown about the history of banking and the division apparently between the Kuhn Loeb and the Morgan, as Morgan would not want to be involved with the Jewish community, whereas Kuhn Loeb was, of course, very friendly to it. In kind of sussing out what's going on behind the scenes here, um, whatever went on behind the scenes that John Foster Dulles got in with Goldman Sachs, um, that seems to be key, along with the fact that there was already, of course, at least one or two Jewish partners, and I'd have to check to see by that time. And so, what is really going on behind the scenes, speculation is is sometimes useful as we try to sort through what's really going on. Um, all right, let's read. The term legal factory applied to Sullivan and Cromwell even before it became familiar in the 1930s. In 1929, the firm doubled its entering class by hiring 13 lawyers to increase its size to 63. The next year, Dulles took on the firm's first women associates, 4 intrepid souls, to prove the progressiveness of the senior partner while filling the ranks with lawyers who did not expect to become partners. Isn't that amazing? And sign of the times, that's not even 100 years ago. So I'm so glad for the change to think of a woman becoming a lawyer and knowing they're never going to make partner just because they're a woman. That's not the world that I want to live in. Okay. The next year, Dulles took on the firm's first women associates. One resigned within a year, but another, Lois Rogers, spent more than 25 years at Sullivan and Cromwell. Half the new recruits stayed fewer than 3 years, forcing the firm to continue its active recruitment policy. That meant 6 new associates in 1931, 4 each in 1932 and 33, and 8 in 1934. Dulles was a master at building up the firm, but he was not an administrator, a drawback that the world got to know when he became Secretary of State in 1953. Oh, don't we know that? At Sullivan and Cromwell, this failing was hidden behind the backup authority of William Nelson Cromwell, who spent a considerable amount of time hounding the young lawyers in the office. Now, well into his 70s, Cromwell roamed the halls of the office, acting as though he were boss. He had a right to approve prospective partners, but his questioning of them became desultory and sometimes vague. Yet he still terrorized the lawyers at the office. Associate Joseph Prendergast was shocked at the different environments at Sullivan and Cromwell in New York and Berlin, where the 18-hour day, a New York routine, was unknown. Though Dulles made Prendergast something of a protege because he had played football at their alma mater, Princeton, Prendergast soon soured on Sullivan and Cromwell. When he got back to New York a year after a year in Berlin, he noticed the Sullivan and Cromwell tick on partners that seemed to go along with the Park Avenue apartments and houses on Long Island. Even Dulles had his habitual hair patting and squint. Quote, they all had something, if only an ulcer, Prendergast noticed. It didn't seem worth it to me, he decided. I kind of know that feeling, having been involved in a few law partnerships in my career. Cromwell remained sharp in business and controversial. A congressional investigation revealed that he was one of 17 rich Americans who had donated more than $10,000 each to the Republican Party and arranged significant tax refunds for clients from Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon. Over 8 years as Treasury Secretary, Mellon dispensed $3.5 billion in refunds. Cromwell collected $222,652 for clients American Water Works and Electric Company and Manatee Sugar Company, on whose boards of directors he sat. Wow. Wow. That's pretty interesting. So $10,000 to the Republican Party, 17 rich Americans. So that's, what's that? Well, that's a lot of money. What's it, 1.7 million? Or anyway, it's a lot of money back then. Arranged significant tax refunds for clients. Wow. From Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon. Yeah, a very famous rich guy, Andrew Mellon. Over 8 years as Treasury Secretary, Mellon dispensed $3.5 billion in refunds. Wow. I never knew that. Cromwell. Cromwell gained further notoriety when he refused to abandon his house to make way for Rockefeller Center, even though the house was owned by Columbia University, which was participating in the new project. Cromwell wanted John D. Rockefeller Jr. himself to ask him to leave. When he didn't, Cromwell declared, quote, my wife died here. I will die here. You can talk to my executors, unquote, thus preventing the building of one Rockefeller Center for nearly 2 decades. Sullivan and Cromwell had a strict hierarchy imposed by the dominating share of income Cromwell controlled and the large number of associates compared with partners. At the time in 1934, when the firm employed 68 lawyers, there were only 16 partners, a ratio of more than 4 to 1. That year, besides constantly hiring new associates, the firm had 8 senior associates who had been there more than 15 years and never expected to make partner. This holdover senior associate status from Cromwell's day enhanced the firm's profitability, especially in adding weight to the litigation and the trust and estates groups, each of which had 3 senior associates, with only one partner in trusts and estates and 2 partners in litigation. Despite the rigid hierarchy, the firm expected the lowliest associate to be treated by the outside world with the same respect as the senior partner. The firm did not put lawyers' names on its letterhead. The main reason was convenience, since changes occurred so often. Dulles did not share Cromwell's penurious habits, but it would have been cumbersome, if not expensive, to put all the names on. The lack of individual names also blurred the lawyer's status in the organization, and the practice of giving responsibility to young recruits allowed the firm to maintain the fiction that every lawyer was an equal because of his Sullivan and Cromwell label. But that's deceptive, is it not? Yep. Within the firm, it was considered considerably more complicated. Senior associates did not fit in the standard pattern of making partner or leaving the firm. They did the work of partners, but did not have to be paid as much. For this reason, litigation and trusts and estates could get away with fewer partners because they had more senior associates, while the general practice, with 36 lawyers, had only two senior associates. One was Walter G. Weichmann, the nephew of conductor Walter Damrosch, and appropriately an expert in copyright law. Parentheses, the firm represented ASCAP, the Songwriters and Publishers Association. The other, Paul W. McQuillan, a public utilities lawyer, eventually became a partner in 1944 after 26 years as an associate. Even when it affected partners' income, Dulles did not hesitate to expand the firm. He was prepared to spread the wealth, which became an issue only when in the mid-1930s, Sullivan and Cromwell considered merging with Cotton and Franklin, the firm that had rejected Dulles when he first tried to find a job in 1911. But the other firm's partners had made more money than Sullivan and Cromwell's, scotching the deal. Most partners approved of Dulles' policy. As Eustace Seligman described it, quote, under Mr. Dulles, Sullivan and Cromwell, I think, went almost further than any other firm in bringing in additional younger men as partners. Under his leadership, we always tried to recognize the younger man and bring them in and give them greater financial rewards than they might get. Dulles headed a senior committee convened to recommend a new financial structure for the firm based on the division of a share of profits that Cromwell was willing to relinquish as his contribution to modernization. Dulles turned the deliberations into a two-pronged effort to give junior partners more of a share and to provide the firm with its own capital base. He accomplished both by letting the juniors buy into the firm to provide the capital. Until then, working capital came from undistributed partners' shares, quote, in an amount of over $1 million each, in an amount of over $1 million, which, if the demands were exercised, would leave the firm wholly bereft of working capital, Dulles explained. Again, that resonates with some experience I had in a partnership long ago. In 1934, he designed a new partnership agreement to give the firm a pool of $750,000 provided by the junior partners, who, quote, are in a better position to do so than the seniors because their income tax rates are much lower. This was true, of course, only because their incomes were so much lower. Included in the new package of firm finances was a provision to withhold the shares of partners who quit and went to work for a competing firm within 5 years. Dulles cabled the proposals to Paris, where Cromwell mulled them over and ratified them. Dulles took the lead in limiting his own shares, which inspired others like Seligman, who said, quote, the only quarrels we ever had with Mr. Dulles on percentages were that we never could get him to take enough. He was remarkably unselfish and unwilling to agree to what we thought he should agree to. Still, in 1936, Dulles' share of firm income, despite the reduced percentage to accommodate juniors, was $377,000. It was no aberration. Dulles earned $345,000 in 37, $249,000 in 38, $199,000 in 39, and $203,000 in 1940. At the time, associates in the firm earned $2,100 a year. Okay, so he's making 100 times what the associates are making. No wonder he's not complaining. In 1934, William Nelson Cromwell bought Janet Dulles an ermine coat and cabled her, quote, short styles are in this year, not long, and if you wish, you could cut coat so as to furnish one for daughter Lilas also, unquote. In 1935, when nearly half of the American lawyers were earning less than $2,000 a year, Janet Dulles got monthly allowances for her household expenses that ranged from $2,000 to $5,000. Her Christmas present from her husband, who took about the same amount as his wife for expenses, was $25,000. Until the mid 1930s, the Dulleses had a chauffeur driven Lincoln. Avery Dulles would sit in the front with the chauffeur, Thomas Sweeney, while his mother sat in the back, ringing a bell to get the chauffeur to get back in his lane. Coach Sweeney would get so mad at Avery, Dulles recalled. Later, Herbert Green, the gardener, doubled as the chauffeur when Dulles wanted to look less ostentatious during the worst of the Depression years. It is hard to conceive just how stupendous Dulles's income was in the 1930s. But as one example, if associates at Sullivan and Cromwell in 1987 were making $71,000, the senior partner would have had to take home $12 million a year to make as much as Dulles did in 1936. Dulles's income contrasts with the experience of 1,500 lawyers in New York City who, in that same year, were prepared to take a pauper's oath to get work relief. And Seligman thought Dulles should have taken even more, indicating just how much they all were making throughout the Depression. The firm was earning so much money that Dulles suggested Cromwell invest some of it, some in some of their hard-up clients. Dulles arranged for Cromwell to put $50,000 into the First Boston Corporation, which Sullivan and Cromwell helped put together as the investment bank spinoff of the First National Bank of Boston and Chase National Bank's investment arm, Harris Forbes. All right, just stop for a second. This is the bank that was later financing the helicopters that were used in the Vietnam War. And this is the bank that has a quote unquote branch in Argentina, which connected supposedly to, yes, the hidden Borman money. So, very interesting uh, rabbit hole to jump down. Please be my guest. Look into First Boston Corporation and how uh, it was connected to Chase National Bank and this investment arm called Harris Forbes. Um, okay. After 6 months negotiations, the new company ultimately decided to raise $9 million as a public corporation. The relationship between First Boston and Sullivan and Cromwell has endured to this day. After an auspicious start, when Sullivan and Cromwell recommended former associate Robert Goldsby to work there. In 1934, Dulles asked Cromwell to invest in a partnership Dulles had concocted between two bankers he trusted, Jean Monnet and Georges Mournain. Dulles wrote Cromwell that Monet, who he had not met at the Versailles negotiations, was, quote, one of the most brilliant men that I know, and, quote, an intimate friend who has the full confidence of many of the most important financial people, unquote. Later to be the architect of the iron and steel community and the founder of the European Economic Community, Monet worked as an investment banker in France. Dulles teamed him up with Mournain, who had been a partner in Lee Higginson and Company, a Boston investment bank that had failed because of one major mistake, backing Ivar Kruger, the Swedish match king, whose suicide in 1932 was one of the stunning events of the Depression. Again, I got to stop and catch my breath and say, wow, Jean Monnet. We were talking, what was I reading the other day about? Well, of course, the European coal and steel community is the beginning of the European economic community, which is then becomes the EEC and then the unification of the currency and all of this stuff. It's all connected. And it's all connected to Sullivan and Cromwell. And, the more I read, the more I want to just dig into these nuggets. Jean Monnet. Dulles introduced the two men, set up Mornane and Company as a private investment bank, put up $25,000 of his own money, and got Cromwell to put up another $25,000 to underwrite its activities. Dulles convinced Cromwell to support the two bankers because they, quote, should produce a large amount of legal fees for us. To which Cromwell replied in a long telegram, quote, use your discretion as to precise terms, but must be strictly on loan basis, enforceable as such, and so declared in documents, because I'm not so concerned about a loan as that I foresee this danger of lawsuits by creditors in all new resurrections or ventures. With Monet conducting business in France and China, Dulles channeled Murnane toward the businesses he wanted to promote. The two men were close friends, both having weekend houses in Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island. Oh man, it's a small, oh, Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island. And know any eugenicists, by the way, gentlemen? Maybe. In his role as a senior partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, Dulles had to entertain lavishly to large numbers of firm clients, as well as hosting an annual firm New Year's cocktail party. But in the intimate setting of his New Year's Eve party for his family and less than a dozen friends, Bournain and his wife were invariably included. The Dulleses and their guests performed an annual ritual of guessing where the Dow Jones stock average would end the following year and what would be the major events and personalities of the next year. Dulles kept the previous year's answers in his office safe and pulled them out on the last working day of the year to present at the party. Dulles and Murnane thought alike, having together helped the conservative Heinrich Brüning escape from Germany just ahead of his planned murder by Hitler's orders. They arranged for him to hide in a Long Island monastery in Cold Spring Harbor, a testimonial to their enduring financial and emotional support of Germany, regardless of the regime in power. Where did they get this emotional support of Germany from? I'm still baffled as to why the Dulleses are so just crazy about Germany. Both also shared the embarrassment of seeing investments they supported in Europe go bad. Bernane's answers to inquiries indicated Lee Higginson's carelessness in the collapse of Kruger's empire. The bankruptcy investigations after Kruger's suicide revealed that the International Telephone and Telegraph Company had warned Murnane about fraud in Kruger's accounts, but Murnane admitted, quote, it never occurred to Lee, Higginson and Company, of which he was a partner, even on hearing IT&T accuse Kruger of falsifying a balance sheet, to suspect that the balance sheets that he had given them. Murnane felt that the situation, quote, seemed serious only because it might result in a public challenge to Kruger's honesty, which might injure his prestige and his company's. Such contempt for the public, another characteristic he shared with Dulles, actually reflected a carelessness that Cromwell recognized in cautioning Dulles over the Monet-Murnane investment. From its incorporation of Murnane in 1935 to its dissolution in 1939, it steadily repaid its backers with engineering deals like the Nash Automobile Company's merger with Kelvinator Refrigerators to make Kelvinator Nash, a precursor of American Motors, which remained a Sullivan and Cromwell client into the 1980s. Dulles introduced Murnane to Solvay and Company, the Belgian chemical company, whose interests the banker represented in America, and Murnane became a member of the board of Allied Chemical after Sullivan and Cromwell had fought its management in 1933. The Depression had its biggest impact on Sullivan and Cromwell when the Democratic administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt demanded new legislation to curb the excesses of the investment community. Dulles and Cromwell inveighed bitterly against the democratic hostility to capitalism and the financial markets. Dulles had endorsed President Herbert Hoover's optimistic belief that, quote, if someone could get off a good joke every 10 days, I believe our troubles would be over, unquote. Sullivan and Cromwell partners reacted angrily to the securities regulation proposed at the beginning of the Roosevelt administration during the famous 100 Days, when 15 statutes fundamentally changed American society. The first draft of the Securities Act, written by Houston Thompson, a former member of the Federal Trade Commission, went beyond the president's demand for, quote, full publicity and information. A young Sullivan and Cromwell partner, Arthur Dean, called the Thompson bill a, quote, hopeless confusion of ill assorted provisions. Eustace Seligman objected that holding corporate directors responsible for the truth of registration statements was, quote, revolutionary and without precedent in Anglo Saxon law, unquote. The chorus of objections prompted a revision supervised by Felix Frankfurter, later a long serving justice of the Supreme Court, but at the time a professor at Harvard Law School and a member of Roosevelt's Brain Trust. The new draft was made in a single day. It limited its demands to, quote, full and fair disclosure and a waiting period between registration and the sale of a security. Sam Rayburn, the wily Texas legislator who headed the House Committee on Interstate and Foreign Commerce, channeled the bill to a subcommittee to prepare a final draft. But the subcommittee sent the final draft to the before the subcommittee sent the final draft to the full committee, Raymond Moley, the head of Roosevelt's Brain Trust, let Dulles and Dean raise their objections. Rayburn was against the idea, but went along if Dulles and Dean would meet the bill's drafters, James Landis, later head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and Benjamin V. Cohen, who knew Frankfurter from Harvard. Dulles agreed, but thoroughly alienated Rayburn's Saturday morning subcommittee meeting with unsubstantiated and indiscriminate accusations. Rayburn, the deft, slow-drawling political manipulator, demanded that the system live up to its pretensions. But Dulles was so violently opposed to the whole New Deal, he took out his rage on Rayburn, claiming that, quote, he was sponsoring legislation that would undermine our financial system. While Dulles abandoned the reserved and dignified manner that underlay his talent for smoothing ruffled feathers, Dean concentrated on details. He showed a much firmer grasp of the legislation and its effect on business, staying in Washington to work on the bill, while Dulles defiantly returned to New York. Though most Sullivan and Cromwell lawyers were heavily involved in securities work required by the newly formulated acts, Dulles continued his vendetta against the New Deal. He recruited clients to defy the 1935 legislation designed to break up the public utility holding companies. The act had several unique features giving the SEC wide powers, which Dulles decided to fight in the courts. Its, quote, death sentence provision, unquote, in Section 11 gave the utilities 3 years to cut back into single integrated systems with natural geographic bases. The SEC was to supervise all service and construction contracts and the institution of a uniform accounting system. Never before had a peacetime American government taken such powers to restructure and control an industry. Public utilities. The head of the new SEC, William O. Douglas, suggested that business people help draft the legislation. Quote, I pointed out to them the great financial rewards available to those who took over the job of redesigning and reorganizing these systems and floating the new securities, unquote. When Dulles urged non-cooperation, Douglas commented wryly, quote, for once principle transcended greed. For once principle transcended greed, unquote. Dulles gathered together the holding company heads in a conference room at 48 Wall Street and fumed, quote, the men who drafted and promoted this law obviously do not know the law or the Constitution. I can assure you that it violates basic constitutional guarantees and that the Supreme Court will strike it down. My strong advice to you, gentlemen, is to do nothing. Do not comply. Resist the law with all your might, and soon everything will be all right. It was at this time that Dulles decided to start a litigation group. Previously, the firm had preferred the British system of considering itself solicitors and hiring well-known barristers like Charles Evans Hughes Jr., George Medallia, and Judge Joseph Proskauer to appear for it in court. To start its litigation group, Dulles tried to lure Harlan Fiske Stone away from the Supreme Court to return to Sullivan and Cromwell. Though polite and regretful to Dulles, Stone was concerned that, quote, steadily the best skill and capacity of the profession has been drawn into the exacting and highly specialized service of business and finance. At its worst, at its best, the changed system has brought to the command of the business world loyalty and a superb proficiency and technical skill. At its worst, it has made the learned profession of an earlier day the obsequious servant of business, and tainted it with the morals and manners of the marketplace in its most antisocial manifestations. Unquote. When that attempt failed, Dulles hired a reputable West Coast litigator, John Higgins, who arrived at the firm to fight the new securities legislation. Higgins tried harassing the Justice Department by postponing the substantive issues with a procedural case he took up to the Supreme Court. He wanted to force the Attorney General to prosecute all the utility companies at once, rather than let there be a test case to be decided first, which would save time and money. Higgins established Sullivan and Cromwell's tradition of inundating the other side in paper as a part of the tactics that gave the firm a reputation for bullying with limitless resources and tireless work. Higgins was extraordinarily hardworking. He had no regard for his own time or anybody else's. Day and night, weekends and holidays, he was at the office and expected the same of others. Higgins won the procedural case, so the Justice Department was swamped with work, simultaneously filing all the utilities cases, each entrenched with its own intricacies and convolutions. The firm's extensive litigation against the New Deal created an awkward dilemma for Harlan Fiske Stone, who kept facing Sullivan and Cromwell in Dulles's campaign against the New Deal. Stone was the only Supreme Court justice to occupy every seat based on seniority before Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed him Chief Justice in 1941 to cap a 21-year career on the court. Stone had a policy of not sitting on Sullivan and Cromwell cases if the client or lawyer arguing the case had been at the firm when he was. But because two other justices also disqualified themselves for their role in the New Deal legislation, Stone had to sit on the case brought to break up the Harrison Williams North American Company under the Public Utilities Holding Company Act of 1935, even though he admitted, quote, as a youngster in the office, I ran errands for the North American Company. It was one of the most important clients after I became a partner in the firm. But he helped provide the majority that upheld the law, costing the utility companies millions of dollars and resulting in their breakup. Cyrus Eaton, later famous for entertaining Nikita Khrushchev at his farm in Ohio, who headed Otis and Company, an important Cleveland investment house, concluded, quote, I came to distrust John Foster Dulles's judgment completely. He was so wrong about the constitutionality of the Public Utility Holding Company Act. Well, I'm going to have to stop here with only 3 pages left of chapter 7. Then we will move on to chapter 8, the one with the most scintillating title yet. The title of chapter 8, Nazi Clients. That'll be next Monday here, same time. Thanks very much for being with me. I will see you guys tomorrow. Looking forward to a reunion with our friends at Protect the Nest, Carol, Tara, and Amber.